Today we will get acquainted with the geometry of primary directions. Take a look at this model of a three-dimensional sphere. The observer is at the center, surrounded by the local horizon. The lines indicate the four cardinal points: south, east, north, and west. The observer sees the celestial sphere above their head, while the part of the sphere under their feet is shaded dark. The entire celestial sphere slowly rotates around its axis, which points to the pole star. During the day, all planets on the celestial sphere, including the Sun and the Moon, slowly rise on the eastern horizon, reach their culmination, and then slowly set in the west. Notice that the planets are aligned in a line. This line is the zodiacal circle, which we see in the computer program. You can see that the zodiacal circle is divided into 12 signs, and the planets are positioned at specific degrees of their corresponding signs. Astronomically, we call this purple line the ecliptic circle. You can also see that some planets are deviated from the ecliptic circle toward the south or north pole. For example, Venus is strongly deviated from the plane of the ecliptic in this horoscope. The degree of this deviation up or down is called celestial latitude. Its position on the zodiacal circle, expressed in degrees starting from 0 Aries, is called celestial longitude. The celestial latitude and longitude of a planet uniquely determines its position on the celestial sphere. We mentioned that fixed stars can conjoin with planets in the plane of the ecliptic. This means that the celestial longitude of the star and the planet are close to each other. At the same time, the star itself can be strongly deviated from the ecliptic and visually appear closer to the poles of the celestial sphere. However, this doesn't prevent a conjunction of the star and planet on the ecliptic. If we divide the celestial sphere into the upper, i.e. northern, and lower, i.e. southern parts, the dividing line is called the celestial equator. Planets move throughout the day parallel to this equator. They rise, culminate, and set along the degrees of the celestial equator. The degrees of the equator are used to measure time and are often expressed in hours and minutes. However, for our convenience, we will express them directly in degrees. If we project a planet onto the celestial equator, the degree where this projection lands is called the right ascension. The degree of the planet's deviation from the equator toward the south or north pole is called the planet's declination. You can see that the right ascension of Venus is 17 degrees of the celestial equator, and the right ascension and declination together are called equatorial coordinates and are also uniquely determine a planet's position on the celestial sphere. You already know that planets can conjoin with fixed stars on the plane of the equator. This means that the star's projection onto the equator is close to the planet's projection, although the star may be deviated from the equator to the south or north by a completely different distance than the planet. This doesn't interfere with the astrological influence of the star on the planet. Why is a planet's equatorial coordinate is called right ascension rather than longitude? First, the rising degree of the equator measures the time throughout the day. Therefore, the rising above the horizon is equivalent to degrees as a measure of time, hence the name ascension for the degrees. On the other hand, astrology often uses another coordinate, namely the degree of the equator that rises together with the planet above the horizon. Look at this illustration. Here the moon is on the eastern horizon. However, along with the moon, this particular degree of the equator also rises. This is called the moon's oblique ascension. You can see that the moon's oblique ascension is 66 degrees of the equator, while the right ascension is 95 degrees, and the difference between these two values is called the ascension difference. This value depends on the observer's geographical latitude. If the observer is on the Earth's equator, the moon's right ascension always coincides with its oblique ascension, but this occurs only at the equator. At any other point of Earth, the oblique and right ascensions differ. This is why the equatorial longitude is called right ascension. What is considered the starting point on the equator and on the ecliptic? The starting point is the intersection of the equator line and the ecliptic line. It is 0-degree right ascension for the equator and 0 Aries for the zodiacal circle. The ecliptic and equatorial coordinates of the planets are always different. For example, Venus is at 20 degrees Aries but at 70 degrees right ascension on the celestial equator. Its deviation from the ecliptic, i.e. celestial latitude, is much smaller than its deviation from the equator, i.e. declination. From a practical point of view, we are most interested in another planetary coordinate, its mundane position. Look at this image. If you draw a line through a planet, for example through Venus, from south to north, this line is called the planet's circle of position. The intersection of this line with the celestial equator is called the planet's mundane position. I mentioned that the star can conjoin with planet's mundane position. This means that the star is located somewhere on the sphere close to this green line. Although the star may visually be in another part of the celestial sphere, its proximity to the green line makes its influence on the planet effective. In other words, on a three-dimensional sphere, a planet's influence is concentrated not at a single point, but along this entire green line. Now let's move to visualization of primary directions. I mentioned earlier that at the moment of birth, the human body and psyche, so to say, remember the imprint that the planet leaves from their position at the moment of birth. Since the planet's influence is distributed along the lines on the celestial sphere, particularly along the circle of position, we can say that the human psyche is especially sensitive to the radiation coming from the circle of position. Imagine that the person has just been born, and the celestial sphere, along with all the planets, begin to rotate. In particular, Jupiter starts moving toward Venus's circle of position. Venus herself has left this spot, but the human body continues to react to everything happening along this green line relative to the local horizon. And for this reason, this line is considered stationary, because it reflects Venus's primary imprint, now fixed in the native's body. When Jupiter in its primary motion reaches Venus's circle of position, the native's body reacts particularly strongly at that moment, and the native receives an additional imprint, this time from Jupiter. This additional imprint overlays the primary imprint of the sky that the person receives at birth. Thus, as the celestial sphere rotates, the human body in the first hours after birth receives separate celestial imprints that layer one on top of another. These imprints presumably create tendencies to form neural connections which lead to hidden motives and actions in the future. For example, if Venus in the horoscope inclines a person to seek a husband, and Jupiter indicates wealth that comes from marriage, an unconscious motive forms in the native's body to find a wealthy husband. This motive doesn't stem from upbringing or life circumstances, it is given from the very moment of birth. For a time, this imprint remains latent, but when the moment comes, it is activated. This creates an irresistible desire to marry a wealthy man. The brain produces numerous micro-decisions unnoticed by the person, which ultimately lead to the native meeting the person they seek. Of course, this is possible only if the social environment, i.e. the context, allows the presence of wealthy men. The movement of Jupiter toward Venus's circle of position is the primary direction, or spatial conjunction of directed Jupiter and natal Venus on the three-dimensional sphere. The path that Jupiter follows in its directional motion is called the directional arc. The length of this arc reflects the time between two imprints, the original imprint from natal Venus and the subsequent imprint from moving Jupiter. This arc also reflects the time when the future combined imprint of Venus and Jupiter will come into effect. The shorter the directional arc, the sooner the event occurs. The longer the directional arc, the later the event occurs. Thus, the length of the directional arc indicates the number of years from birth until the activation of this imprint from Jupiter and Venus, which will lead to the corresponding event. We continue the topic of primary directions. If the conjunctions of two planets on the celestial sphere are clear, the situations with aspect is more complex. On the three-dimensional sphere, it is completely unclear in which plane to cast, for example, Venus's square. I can project the square along the plane of the ecliptic, or along the plane passing through Venus, which is parallel to the ecliptic. I can project Venus's aspect in any other plane. Morinus brilliantly solved this problem. He constructed such a plane of aspects in which the directions of planetary aspects to the significators of different houses coincide with reality with an accuracy of few months. Morinus said that on the one hand, the plane of aspects should be close to the plane of the ecliptic, because historically, astrologers considered aspect precisely on the zodiacal circle. On the other hand, one must take into account the planet's celestial latitude. Obviously, a position of Venus, which is, in this horoscope, is above the ecliptic, should be strictly opposite on the celestial sphere, that is, below the ecliptic. At the same time, if we consider Venus's actual motion, including its loops, we can see that Venus gains celestial latitude, reaching its maximum in the future. Here, the red line shows the real motion of Venus throughout the year relative to the zodiacal circle. You can see what Venus's loop looks like on the three-dimensional sphere. Venus's maximum latitude is marked here with a dashed line. Morinus believed that the plane of aspects should always be inclined from the plane of the ecliptic by this amount of planet's maximum latitude. You can see that the yellow line here represents the plane of aspects. On the one hand, it passes through Venus, and on the other, it touches the dashed line. Morinus reasoned as follows. If a planet gains celestial latitude moving from its previous node to the point of maximum elevation, that the plane of aspects should also gain celestial latitude along the zodiac signs. When the planet reaches its maximum, it is at the very top edge of the circle of aspects. This case is shown in this illustration. Finally, when the planet begins to decrease its celestial latitude, the plane of aspects should also move toward the ecliptic along the signs. You can see that in this illustration. Venus has already left its maximum and is approaching the ecliptic. For this reason, the aspect circle, the yellow line, also begins to approach the ecliptic. At the same time, the aspect circle still passes through Venus and simultaneously touches the dashed red line. Morinus combined physical, geometrical, and astronomical principles in constructing his plane of aspects, and it proved to be a brilliant solution. The accuracy of directions using this plane increased dramatically compared to the tools of other astrologers. Look at the illustration. Here Venus casts a sinister square in the plane of aspects. This aspect is labeled by the letter A. Now I will start moving the sphere. You can see that Venus's square slowly moves toward Jupiter's circle of position. The red trajectory along which the square moves is the direction of Venus's square to Jupiter. A change in the inclination of the aspect circle, i.e. the yellow line, even by 1 degree, leads to a change in the aspect's position in space and to a change of the length of the directional arc, and this would result in difference between prediction and reality of several years. But Morinus's plane ensures forecast accuracy within few months, no more. Morinus also demonstrated in practice that the most accurate key for converting the directional arc into years of life is the key of German mathematician Valentine Naibod. This is the coefficient by which we multiply the number of degrees of the directional arc to obtain years of life. At the moment of recording this video, I'm unaware of any astrological software, except the one provided to students of our natal astrology course, that could calculate primary directions in the form constructed by Morinus. Sometimes there are situations where the directional arc exceeds 180 degrees. In this case, we simply swap the promissor and the significator. The moving point is the significator, and the stationary point is the circle of position passed through the promissor. Look at this illustration. The yellow circle is Venus's plane of aspects. Venus cast a dexter sextile in this plane. If we allow the dexter sextile to reach the circle position of Mars, this aspect would travel a very long path, more than 180 degrees, which means more than 180 years from birth to the event. But people don't live that long. Therefore, we swap the start and end points. Now we pass the circle of position through Venus's sextile and allow Mars to move toward this circle of position. Now I will start the motion of the celestial sphere and you will see the picture in motion. See, Venus's sextile has already moved from its natal position, but the human body remembers this degree, or rather the circle of position passed through this degree. Mars moves toward Venus's natal square, or rather the circle of position passed through it. When Mars reaches the green line, the human body receives an additional imprint from Mars. The length of the path Mars travels indicates the amount of time until this combined imprint from Mars and Venus's square relative to the sphere of life represented by Mars comes into effect, creating the predicted event. Such directions are called converse directions. They are no less effective than direct directions and produce future events to the same extent.